embraces the totality of it, obviously he speaks of presence. So when I say presence, presence is a positive statement. When I say the freedom from thinking is a negative statement. Not in a conventional sense, but in the native, it points of removing something. And then whatever is there when you remove something, you don't need to talk about, because you need to know it for yourself, so that you don't need to talk about it. So I use both. I use the negative and the positive. So I speak of the power of presence, and sometimes I speak of the cessation of thinking, finding the gap between two thoughts. Same thing, just expressed or approached from a different angle. Now, at first, when you're not thinking, perhaps while you're taking a few steps, for example, you're walking from one end of the room to the other at home, that's a good opportunity for practicing not thinking. 5 steps, depending how big your room is. 6, 7 steps. Just present, just alert. An alert presence rather than a person walking. An alert presence walking across the room. And then the alert presence opens the window. And then the alert presence looks out of the window. And it perceives sense perceptions through that alert presence, and there's an aliveness there. Doesn't need to be called anything. And then the alert presence walks away. And then perhaps thought comes flooding back in. And then after a while, another opportunity. Why not? While you're filling the kettle for a cup of tea, you turn on the tap and the water comes out, begins to fill the kettle, and it goes, and you're just suddenly present again, not thinking, just perceiving, just stillness. And then you can feel everything. You can not only hear the water filling the kettle, you can actually enjoy all these little things. It's a pleasant sound, and then you can feel the handle of the kettle in your left hand. And then you can hear the sound the kettle makes when you put it on the stove. And then you turn on the gas or the electricity, and then gradually the water begins to make a sound. This can be a little space that because there's nothing else to do, why not use it to bring in presence into your life? And so the person steps aside, the person subsides and is replaced by that intense space of awareness. That is the shift in consciousness. The person can still operate when the person is needed. It's just not confused with who you really are anymore. The person that consists of all your mind activity and so on. The person, the form identity of you, of course that still operates in this world. It's needed to do things. You not only have a physical body, you also have certain life history, and you have certain psychological makeup. Those things can still operate in this world, but they're not confused anymore with who you are, because you are the presence. And that's not a conceptual or intellectual belief. It's a direct realization of you sense yourself as the underlying presence. And you can only do that when the mind becomes still. And what's left is that. That's power. And that's a positive statement when I say that. Or in a negative statement, that it's emptiness. Or as Jesus called it, fullness. Jesus said, I want you to have the fullness of life. Or I want you to have life in its fullness. or in other translations it's called, he says, I want you to have abundant life. He doesn't mean many things by abundant. He's not into buying lots of things. That wasn't the teaching. So he doesn't mean abundant, that you could become abundant, life could give you things, but that's not where the power, he talks about the power of the fullness itself, which is the source of all life, which is here and now, which is the presence. That presence is the fullness of life, which is a positive, described from a positive angle, or it is the emptiness described from a negative angle. The same thing, the same no thing. Stillness, of course, is another word for it that I sometimes use, and that is also somewhat negative, because stillness for most people implies just absence of noise. But of course stillness has presence in it. Stillness is another word for presence. If you can't be still, which means aware, thoughtless awareness, no matter how many workshops you have attended, how many scriptures you have studied, how many books you have read, or how many teachers you have seen, or how many meditation retreats you've been on, if there's stillness is not there in your daily life at all, or only confined to when you do a formal meditation practice, then really the spiritual dimension is still not there in your life, no matter how much you talk about it. And there are people who have studied many scriptures, extremely knowledgeable, can quote any spiritual teacher that lived, or philosopher that lived 10 or 1,000 years ago, can have them quote them all, but nothing, there's no stillness, it's just stuff in the mind. They have collected signposts, because all these, whatever any spiritual teaching tells you, is a signpost. And so some people become collectors of signposts. They never go where the signpost points. They say, oh, that's an interesting signpost. Let's compare this signpost to that one. Do they point to the same place? Well, I don't know. But what do you think, Professor? Well, let's look at a third one, because this one seems to point in that direction. Well, let's look more closely. Let's analyze the signpost, and let's get the microscope and really cut it. Okay, I think I'm going to write a book about that. You can spend your whole life and think you're very spiritual, and the world tells you that, yes, you're the professor of divinity. That's what it's called. You get a PhD in divinity. Wow. Or you are the Pandit in India, with a long beard and your mind is full of knowledge. Not the truth. India always has had, at any given